When tooling down a highway and your beautifully restored car begins to take slight yet uncommanded turns, you've got to ask yourself, are you feeling lucky? After creeping home, some investigation grounded my R2. The steering box had to come out. The Ross steering gear is original to the 63 and 64 Avanti as well as many other Studebaker models. According to LarsCorp.com, the simple yet rugged Ross steering units were utilized in its various iterations in American Bantam, Crosley, Graham models 74, 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, Jeep, International Scouts, Auburns, Duesenbergs, Hupmobiles, Pierce Arrows, and Rio Flying Cloud, as well as some European automotive applications. Ross was bought by TRW in the 1960s and continued distributing the Ross design until 1971. Recirculating ball and rack and pinion units were replacing the design. The basic Ross design consists of a worm gear lever fitted with a stud follower attached to a cross shaft lever sometimes called the sector shaft, an elegant and versatile design lending to iterations for both light and heavy-duty application. Although sharing the Ross name and basic design concept, the Ross box is far from universal across automotive use, implying the unit on the Avanti is not the same as configurations for other cars. The Avanti's Ross box is a heavy-duty version known as the Ross cam and roller type, featuring a single follower stud mounted on double tapered bearings. The stud is free to turn at the point of contact with the lever. This design lends to great dependability and longevity, but the uninformed backyard mechanic who dares to remove and clean or repair the double taper can unwittingly poise his car for a deadly accident. My steering has been exhibiting increasingly excessive play despite proper adjustment of the follower clearance, new tie rod ends, proper bell crank adjustment, and newly rebuilt suspensions. The latest inspection revealed lateral cross shaft play, end play on the worm gear where there is to be none, and to my horror, slippage of the rag joint on the worm gear post. The latter condition being most frightening since spline slippage could cause total loss of steering. Removing the steering box from the Avanti is a leisurely 2.5-hour job for the R2 with a T10 transmission. A lift is a huge aid, allowing the car to be lifted high enough to give you arm's length access to everything from below. Jack stands, a floor jack, and a clean, level area to work from are a must. Remove the left front tire to allow a little more maneuvering room. The starter needs to be removed, the left header pipe, and the second section of the exhaust pipe ending at the resonator. Then, the left motor mount nut must be removed. Remove the pitman arm's 1 1/8-inch securing nut from the Ross cross shaft. Then, the pitman arm. A large pickle fork works well to coax the pitman arm from the spline cross shaft. There is no room for a typical puller. By hand, turn the wheels as far to the right as possible. This will allow enough room to extract the Ross box without removing the Bendix power steering valve if your Avanti is so equipped. From the top, remove the 2 bolts and shaped retainers holding the rag joint to the steering column flange. Be careful not to lose the washer for the horn contact. Then, using a 12-point socket, remove the special pinch bolt on the Ross box side of the rag joint. This will allow the joint to slip further down the post to give additional maneuvering room when rotating the heavy Ross box for removal. Remove the 3 long bolts securing the steering box to the frame. The box is now free from the car. In my case, the engine has to be raised 1 inch on the left side to allow the steering box to pass between the frame and the exhaust manifold. I use a section of 2x4 between the left front edge of the oil pan and a floor jack to lift the engine for the short time needed to rotate the Ross box for extraction. Once the box is out, the floor jack is relaxed. I cleaned the outside of the unit before progressing. And here is the Ross steering box ready for disassembly. Photographing the important steps of this procedure can greatly aid in diagnosis of problems and reassembly. Nitrile gloves are suggested for working inside the Ross box. Its sticky lubricant having the qualities reminiscent of RTV can render your hands a hazard. Extracting as much as possible of the pricey lubricant before removing the side cover is a practical move. There are 2 plugs, a drain plug at the lower edge of the cover, and a filler breather plug on top of the box. I use a number 10 can as a support and a clean cottage cheese container inside the can as a collector. Plugs removed, the box is balanced with the drain plug over the cheese container. It takes a day, but gravity will allow a goodly portion of the gooey lubricant to come out. To speed up the process, working a long air nozzle through the filler port using about 20 psi will clear enough lubricant to make removal of the side cover a clean maneuver. Now is the time to remove the rag joint and examine it for slippage. Tap off the joint. Scroll lines across the spline indicate slippage and need for replacement. It is unlikely the worm gear post spline will have significant wear as it is harder metal than the rag joint clamp. The woven material should be firm and not loose on the post clamp. As you can see, this rag joint post clamp shows signs of rotational scoring. With the cover removed, use an index finger to scoop the majority of the lubricant from the case. With most lubricant scooped out, a gentle air blast can help push lubricant from tight places for removal. Now, remove the cross shaft. If you plan to replace all the lubricant, then flushing with a solvent saves time. Do take the time to examine the lubricant for particulates. Particulates would verify potential repair needs. Yellow specks suggest bushing wear. Bright metal specks suggest follower, worm gear, bearing race, or cover damage. And plastic specks would indicate bearing cage damage. Reusing lubricant with any particulate content will reduce the durability of the steering box. Before removing the 4 bolts that retain the worm gear, check for end play and wobble. The post should exhibit 0 longitudinal or lateral movement. Any lateral movement could indicate bearing damage or wear. Longitudinal end play and lateral movement of the post contribute to excessive steering wheel play. Carefully remove the worm gear retainer. There are 6 factory-installed shims between the gearbox body and the retainer that are used to set 0 end play. The 3 thinner shims tend to stick to the 3 thick shims. Remove the worm gear horizontally. This will retain the orientation of parts. There are 4 or 6 parts of concern: 2 bearing races, 2 caged ball bearing assemblies, and, depending on the box model, 2 retaining rings. Note their orientation and maintain their pairing for reassembly. This Ross box does not have retaining rings. The bearings are available at a fantastical price. If they were properly oriented to begin with and the correct lubricant used, their condition should be reusable. The worm gear retainer has a seal. There are no replacements for this seal available, which suggests not disturbing it. Its purpose is not to retain the box lubricant, but rather to prevent moisture and dirt from entering the box. With the box completely disassembled, it is time to clean all the components. The cross shaft needs only to be wiped of its lubricant and lightly wire brushed to remove surface staining. Unless the roller pin traveler needs service, do not disassemble it. Do not remove much of its lubricant unless its rotation is not smooth. The rotating stud consists of inner and outer tapered surfaces riding on loose needle bearings held in place by a washer, a tab locking ring, and a nut. If there is no play on the roller pin, leave it alone. Do examine the lock tabs at the place they are bent over to lock the nut's position. Any sign of fatigue or stress should prompt you to engage previously unbent tabs of the lock washer or to replace the lock washer. That's Studebaker part number 172441. A minimum of 2 good condition engaged tabs, I think, is paramount. I tell you this because the steering box of my Avanti was opened and serviced before I obtained the car. I removed my side cover during restoration to examine the condition of the box. I photographed the interior. I failed to notice that the single tab engaging the lock washer was damaged at its bend. The follower had been removed and, when replaced, its nut was secured with the same tab. I reassembled the Ross box and installed it on the car. 2 years later, when I had completed restoration, I was driving the car only for the second time when the steering suddenly locked. Luckily, the car was in my yard. It took some time, but I finally diagnosed a steering box problem. This is when I learned how to remove the box from a completed car. What I found was the locking tab had broken off. The nut spun enough to allow the needle bearings to spill into the case. The follower and the bearings, now loose, jammed the worm gear against the case. Imagine this happening when driving on the road. Had I recognized the fatigued lock washer, the condition could have been mitigated. As it was, the car was destined to have a steering failure and potentially a fatal crash. It's frightening to know that a sliver of metal is all there is between a carefree drive or utter catastrophe. But I ramble. Clean the worm gear and examine it for signs of wear. Because of low rotational speeds and roller cam follower, the gear should be pristine. The bearings at either end share the brunt of wheel turning torque, though damage to the softer cross-shaft bushings would likely occur first. The end bearing assemblies are identical. The ball bearings are caged in a nylon retainer that would be damaged by improper orientation during assembly. Effortless rotation when assembled verifies their correct orientation. The main part of the Ross case is really a rough sandcast molding with only machined areas smoothed. The rough sandcast surface, especially on the inside of the case, will collect and trap dirt. Vigorous brushing or bead blasting will release a considerable amount of captured debris. Although my cross shaft was not leaking, with the box so far disassembled, replacing the seal would be routine. The seal can be dislodged by piercing the seal surface and prying with a screwdriver. Worn bushings are signaled by visible scoring of their surface as well as a large amount of yellow metal in the lubricant. The split bushings, inner and outer, however, need to be driven out from the inside. Mine were very tight. A little help from a hacksaw blade along the split helps reduce their tenacious hold. The fact that the inside of my shaft housing had sporadic ridged areas suggests that my bushings had been replaced. A round file easily smooths the disturbed bore. With the bushings removed, I use a large, flat bastard to take any high spots off the cover interfaces. Then all is cleaned again to remove any metal filings. It's time to order parts. My repair needs these items. Reassembly is a piece of cake. Maybe. Make sure your new bushings are of the proper length. Direct replacements are not available. There is a center lube hole in the cross shaft housing that must not be covered. That makes resizing the replacement bushings length imperative. I use a lathe to turn the bushings and a hacksaw blade to gently cut it. A small grinder is used to bevel the inner and outer edges of the cut to remove burrs. A thorough cleaning follows. Tap the bushings into the cross shaft housing with a mandrel having a landing slightly smaller than the cross shaft. This will prevent deforming and twisting of the bushing. It is unlikely the cross shaft can now be installed due to insufficient bushing clearance. I took my unit to a machine shop that has a bushing sizing machine that assures roundness and linearity along the length of the bushing. A small bore hone typically used on brake cylinders can be used in a pinch. The end result wanted is zero lateral movement and smooth rotation of the cross shaft. Again, a thorough cleaning will be needed after sizing the bushing. Now, install the outer seal. Pre-lube all worm gear surfaces with Ross lubricant. Install the lower bearing race. Properly orient the lubricated bearings on the worm gear ends. Install the worm gear horizontally. Install the top bearing and race. Place the shims, then the shaft retainer cap. Install the bolts on the retainer cap and torque to about 25 foot-pounds. Check end play. Remove the shims as necessary to obtain smooth rotation of the worm gear with zero end play. This shaft had 4/1000ths of an inch end play, so 2 of the 2/1000ths shims are omitted. This removed both the end play and shaft wobble. Torque the caps to about 30 to 35 foot-pounds. Lube the cross shaft and insert. You can put a majority of lubricant in now so you do not have to push it through the small filler hole. Keep it off the cover gasket area. Back off the follower tensioning screw even with the cover interior surface. Place the gasket, followed by the cover, and insert the 6 retaining bolts Torque the bolts in a 1-4-2-5-3-6 order. Make the follower tensioner finger tight, slip on the rag joint, and the Ross box is ready for reinstallation. A little cosmetic paint is in order. I prefer to use bright colors in the engine bay instead of the spec black. It simply makes finding developing issues easier. Old cars will always have something to deal with. The installation process is the reverse of the removal, with two caveats. Set the cross shaft to center throw, and center the steering wheel position. Lift the engine and wiggle the unit between the engine and the frame, then lower the engine. Align the rag clamp with the steering column flange. To hold the box in position while retaining some maneuverability, replace the top front bolt that holds the box to the frame. Once the rag joint studs are engaged on the steering shaft, put the other two frame bolts in place with nuts only finger tight. Bolt the rag joint to the steering flange, being certain the horn ground is engaged on one of the bolts. Putting in the rag joint clamping bolt comes next. To do so earlier will limit your maneuvering in aligning the rag joint. The 12-point bolt will need the rag joint wedged into position so the bolt will pass through the relief in the worm gear post. Once in, it can be tightened as much as you dare. Loose or just tight enough will not do. The steering wheel should be acceptably centered, if not spot on. If not, then at the end of the video, I will describe how to center the steering wheel. To time the pitman arm to the steering box, turn the steering wheel to the right lock and the front wheels to the right as far as they will go. Move the pitman to the end of the cross shaft and engage it on the spline so the mark on the pitman and the line on the shaft match. If you have to adjust the wheels even a small amount to line up the marks, indicates that the steering rod is out of adjustment. Once centered on the shaft, spin on the nut. Verify proper steering alignment with lock-to-lock steering wheel position. It should be good to go. Torque the steering box, then the cross shaft nut. The engine mount nut and starter insertion are next. Finally, the second section of tailpipe, then the header pipe. A new exhaust gasket would be a good idea. While the car is off the ground, it's always good practice to check the entire underneath for anomalies. Adjust the lash of the cross shaft and lock its position with its jam nut. Now replace the left wheel. If the steering wheel is not completely centered, you will have to remove the steering wheel and physically center it on the column. You may need a puller. I would suggest confirming straight tracking before changing the steering wheel position. Centering the steering wheel will also reset your turn signal switch mechanism to its proper home position. Driving an Avanti was a dream before I met John, Betty, Mike, and Linda Meyer of Meyer's Studebaker. With their help and some hard work, dreams can come true. Putting the car on the ground, I'm ready to roll.